The tin box was cold against Eleanor Whitcomb's fingertips. She had not expected it to be cold. She had, in truth, not expected it to be anything at all. She had reached behind the rotting red velvet curtain because her hand had been drawn there the way a moth is drawn to a candle, without reason, without plan, only with the certainty of something waiting on the other side. Her fingers closed around the small rectangle, and a fine layer of dust came away with it. She drew it out slowly, the way one might draw a sleeping child from a crib. The afternoon light, falling through a broken slot in the theater roof, caught the lid of the box. There were 3 words written there in a young man's careful hand, and the moment Eleanor Whitcomb read those 3 words, the past 56 years of her life folded themselves into a single, sharp breath. She sat down on the dusty stage of the Glenroy Bijou Theater. She held the box in her lap, and for the first time since the spring of 1969, Eleanor Whitcomb remembered exactly who she was, before the world had taught her how to forget. But to understand what she found in that box, what she had been forgetting for half a century, you have to know who Eleanor was at 18, and the boy who once held her hand in row K, seat 12. At 74, Eleanor Whitcomb kept the kind of small, careful life that nobody noticed and nobody missed. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Maple Street in Asheville, North Carolina. The apartment had been her late husband Walter's idea. When his back began to ache too much for the stairs of their old house, they had downsized, and then he had died 8 years ago in his sleep on a Sunday morning before the church bells, and she had stayed. Her 3 children called on holidays and birthdays. Sarah, the oldest, lived in Portland with her wife and ran a small architecture firm. Michael lived in Boston, divorced, with 2 teenage sons who never wrote thank-you notes for the birthday checks. Caroline, the youngest, had moved to Phoenix for the dry air and had not been east in 4 years. Eleanor did not blame them for any of it. She had raised them to live their own lives, and they had taken her seriously, and there were worse things in this world than to have raised children who took you seriously. She rose every morning at 6:30. She ate 2 slices of toasted rye bread with apricot preserves. She drank 1 cup of coffee with cream. She watered the African violet on the kitchen windowsill. On Mondays and Thursdays, she walked 4 blocks to the public library where she had volunteered for 11 years, shelving returned books in the children's section. The mothers who brought their toddlers in did not know her name, but they smiled at her, and she smiled back, and that was its own small daily exchange of warmth. On Tuesdays and Fridays and Saturdays, she had nothing in particular to do. She would clean a kitchen that was already clean. She would water the violet that was already watered. She would sit by the window with a book she had read before and let the afternoon move across the floorboards like a slow, polite visitor who did not wish to disturb her. In the October of her 74th year, her doctor, a young man with kind eyes whose name she could never quite remember, sat across from her in his small office and listened to her describe the headaches and the tiredness, and the way she sometimes forgot what she had walked into the kitchen for. He ran her blood. He read the results. He told her that there was nothing wrong with her body that he could find, and then he said, very gently, "Mrs. Whitcomb, sometimes loneliness has its own symptoms. It is not a disease, but it can ache like one." She had nodded. She had thanked him. She had not cried until she was back in her car in the parking lot with the keys still in her hand and the windshield gone soft with the slow gray rain of an Asheville autumn. That winter, on a Tuesday afternoon when the snow was just beginning to stick to the windowsills, Eleanor sat down at her small kitchen table with her cup of tea and opened her laptop. She read the online edition of the Glenroy Sentinel, a paper she had paid for since 2014 for reasons she had never examined. And on page 7, beneath a notice about a missing collie and an obituary for a woman she did not know, she saw the words that would change everything. Property auction, County of Morgan. The Glenroy Bijou Theater, 412 Main Street, sold for non-payment of property taxes. Sealed bids by mail, minimum bid $10, deadline December 15th. As is condition. Buyer assumes all liabilities and repairs. Eleanor read the notice 3 times. She closed the laptop. She walked to her bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. The one Walter had never asked about, the one she had carried with her through 48 years of marriage. From the bottom, beneath the wedding quilt her mother had made, she drew out a small leather-bound diary with brass corners. She had not opened it in 20 years. The handwriting inside was looping and uncertain, the script of a 17-year-old girl trying to seem older than she was, and the pages smelled of cedar and time. His name had been Daniel Reeves. Everyone called him Danny. He was 19 and she was 18, and on the 2nd of April, 1968, he had taken her to see Bonnie and Clyde at the Glenroy Bijou Theater because his shift didn't end until 11, and it was the only way they could be together. He had worked the projector since he was 16. His uncle Mike had been the head projectionist for 30 years and had taught Danny how to splice film, how to lace the reels, how to time the changeover so that the audience never noticed. Danny had loved the work. He had loved the smell of celluloid. He had loved Eleanor more than the work, which was no small thing because Danny Reeves had loved the work the way some men love their God. They had planned to marry the summer of 1970. He had given her a promise ring, a thin silver band with no stone, all he could afford on $1.40 an hour. She still kept it taped to the inside back cover of the diary, beneath a square of yellowed Scotch tape that had gone brittle with the decades. In the March of '69, Danny's draft number had been called. He had not run to Canada the way 2 boys from his class had done. He had said it was not in him to run, and Eleanor had not asked him to be anything other than what he was, and so he had shipped out. He had left for Basic on the 14th of April. He had been killed on the 12th of July, just outside An Loc, by a mortar that had landed in the wrong place at the wrong time. His mother had called Eleanor from the kitchen phone of the Reeves family farmhouse. Eleanor had heard her own voice from very far away saying, yes, ma'am, I understand." She had not gone to the funeral. Her father had not allowed it because she and Danny had never been formally engaged, and her father had said it would not be proper. She had stayed home in her room and pressed her face into a pillow that smelled of her own hair, and she had wept, a particular kind of weeping that women of her generation had been taught to do quietly so as not to disturb the household. 6 years later, she had married Walter Whitcomb, a kind insurance adjuster from Tennessee with a soft laugh and a tolerance for her quiet evenings. He had not asked her about Danny, and she had not told him, though once or twice in the early years he had heard her say a name in her sleep that was not his own, and he had let it pass without comment because Walter had been that sort of man. She had loved Walter. She had loved him in the way of a woman who knows that the first love does not return, and that the second love is a different country with its own slow and sturdy weather. She had loved Walter for 48 years, and when he died, she had grieved him properly. But there was a small room in her chest that Walter had never been given the key to, and Eleanor had stopped knocking on the door of that room a long time before he died. On the 12th of December, sitting at her kitchen table in Asheville while the snow gathered at the corners of the storm windows, Eleanor Whitcomb wrote a check for $10 made out to the County of Morgan, Tennessee. She placed it in an envelope along with a single sheet of paper on which she had typed her sealed bid. She walked, in the snow, to the corner mailbox. She dropped the envelope through the slot. She walked home. She did not tell anyone what she had done, because she could not have explained it, and because there was no one left who would have asked. The deed arrived in a manila envelope on the 2nd of February. There had been no other bidders. The county had been, the accompanying letter said, grateful to be relieved of the property. The keys, 3 of them, brass on a rusted iron ring, were taped to the inside flap of the envelope. Eleanor packed a small suitcase. She packed her brown leather handbag with the brass clasp, her glasses, her medication, a thermos of strong tea, and the leather-bound diary from the cedar chest. She told her neighbor Mrs. Albright that she would be away for a week, possibly 2. Mrs. Albright, who had a spare key, agreed to water the African violet. Eleanor got into her 10-year-old Buick LeSabre on a Tuesday morning before the sun was fully up. and she drove 4 hours west into the Appalachian foothills, toward a town she had not seen in 54 years. Glenroy, Tennessee, had been a coal town once and a railroad town after that, and was now mostly a place that people drove through on the way to somewhere else. The main square was the same square Eleanor remembered. The brick was the same brick. The clock above the courthouse still said 3:15, the way it had said 3:15 in 1968, because the clock had been broken since 1962, and nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it. Eleanor parked her Buick in front of a building with a marquee that had once said, in 3-foot red letters, Glenroy Bijou. Now, most of the letters were gone. What remained spelled, by accident, the word O-Z. Eleanor sat in her car and looked at that word for a long time before she got out, because some accidental words mean more than they should. The brass key was cold in her gloved hand. She climbed the 3 steps to the lobby doors. The doors were oak, with Art Deco brass handles in the shape of stylized stars. She had stood at these doors 1,000 times as a girl, waiting for Danny to finish his shift, watching the streetlight come on as the dusk thickened over Main Street. She turned the key. The lock resisted, then gave with a soft metallic click that sounded to Eleanor's ears like a held breath finally being let out. The first smell that met her was dust. The second was something deeper and stranger, the dry, sweet ghost of buttered popcorn from 40 years ago, baked into the carpet and the velvet and the very plaster of the walls. Eleanor stood in the lobby with her hand still on the doorknob, and for a moment she could not move. The lobby was almost exactly as she remembered it. The curved concession counter, its glass case empty and clouded. The brass cash register still bolted in place. The framed posters along the wall, Dr. Zhivago, Bonnie and Clyde, the sound of music in the heat of the night. Their colors leached to a pale, sun-bleached lavender, but still hanging where they had hung the night the theater had closed in 1987. Eleanor closed the door behind her. The street sounds of Glenroy fell away, and there was only the soft creak of an old building settling on its bones and her own breath and the muffled drumming of her heart against the wool of her cardigan. She walked, very slowly, across the lobby. The carpet had been red once. Now it was the color of a forgotten thing. Her shoes made no sound. At the inner doors, she paused. Then she pushed through them, into the auditorium itself, where she had not set foot since the spring of 1969. The auditorium was dim. The high windows along the side walls were boarded over from the inside, but light came through 3 places. A long thin slot in the roof where a panel had rotted through, a half-broken stained glass medallion above the rear balcony, and a small round opening in the projection booth wall, 56 years dark, where the projector beam had once thrown its rectangle of light onto the screen. The seats stretched out before her in rows of red velvet, most of them still upright, though several in the back rows had collapsed in on themselves, their springs erupting through the worn upholstery like rusted flowers. A heavy chandelier hung from the center of the ceiling, dust shrouded into a single gray ornament. The walls, on either side, were painted with the faded forest mural she had memorized as a girl in the long minutes before the lights went down. Deer at a stream, a cabin among the pines, a sky that had once been blue and was now the color of a long-handled silver spoon. The proscenium arch was edged in peeling gilt. The red velvet curtain that hung in front of the screen was thick with dust and torn at the bottom hem. Behind it, she knew, the screen would be moth-eaten and yellowed, but the curtain was still hanging. Eleanor stood in the center aisle and listened to the building breathe. After a long time, she began to walk. She walked down the slight incline of the aisle, past row A, past row B, past the seats she did not know. At row K, she stopped. She turned right. She counted 12 seats in. She put her hand on the back of seat 12 and stood very still. The seat was the same seat, the wood was the same wood. The brass number plate, 12, was tarnished but still legible. She lowered herself into the seat slowly, the way a woman of 74 lowers herself into anything, and she rested her hand on the armrest where, A lifetime ago, Danny Reeves's hand had rested through the entire 2 hours and 17 minutes of Dr. Zhivago. He had been wearing a denim jacket with a torn pocket. He had smelled of soap and the faint chemical of film cement. He had whispered to her, just before the lights went down, that he loved her, and she had whispered back that she loved him too. And they had held hands all the way through the snow scenes of Russia until the credits rolled and the lights came up and the world resumed its ordinary business. In row K, seat 12, on a Tuesday afternoon in February at the age of 74, Eleanor Whitcomb sat in the dark theater, and she wept. She wept without sound, the way a woman weeps when she has been trained from girlhood to make her grief small. The tears slid down through the lines of her face and into the collar of her cream blouse and disappeared. She did not cover her face. She did not move at all. She let the weeping happen the way one lets weather happen, knowing it will pass when it is finished and not before. When it was finished, she sat for a long time more in the silence. Then she stood up. She straightened the front of her cardigan. She wiped her cheeks with the back of one gloved hand. She walked back up the aisle to the lobby. She found, in the lobby's narrow utility closet, an old broom with a wooden handle, 3 feet long, the bristles brittle, but still bristles. She found a metal dustpan with a rolled rim. She took off her coat and laid it across the concession counter. She rolled up the sleeves of her cardigan to the elbow, and she bent, carefully with the small inward catch of pain in her lower back that she had stopped complaining about years ago, and she began in the lobby of the Glenroy Bijou Theater, in the gathering dusk of a February afternoon, to sweep. She stayed at the Glenroy Inn, a 6-room bed and breakfast on the corner of Main and Elm, run by a woman named Margaret Halloran. Margaret was 67, the daughter of a man Eleanor had once known in high school, though Margaret did not know that yet. The room was $45 a night and came with breakfast and a thermos of coffee left on the dresser at dawn. Eleanor settled in. She put her brown handbag on the nightstand. She placed the leather-bound diary on the small writing desk by the window. She unpacked her 3 changes of clothes and her practical shoes, and she lay down on the chenille bedspread for a few minutes to gather herself for what came next. She gave herself 7 days. She told herself she would clean for 7 days, and then she would decide what to do. She did not know yet what she would decide. On the first day, she swept the lobby. She filled 3 trash bags with cobwebs and rodent droppings and the brittle wrappers of candy bars that had been eaten in another century. Beneath one of the radiators, she found a single yellowed ticket stub, the perforations still crisp. Bonnie and Clyde, Saturday night showing. November 11th, 1967. Admit 1.25. She held the stub in her palm and remembered, with a clarity that surprised her, the dress she had worn to that movie. Pale yellow, sleeveless, a thin yellow ribbon at the waist. Danny had told her she looked like a candle, and she had laughed, and they had walked home in the cold November air with her arm tucked into his. On the second day, she climbed the narrow back staircase to the projection booth. The booth was small, no more than 10 feet square, with a long window of thick glass facing the screen below. The 2 big carbon arc projectors still stood there, squat black machines on heavy steel stands, festooned with cobwebs, their real arms hanging limp like the arms of a sleeping crane. Eleanor knew nothing about projectors except what Danny had told her in the long evenings of 1968, and she had remembered surprisingly much of it. She touched the side of the closer projector, and her glove came away black with carbon dust and time. It was on the back wall of the projection booth behind the second projector that she found the carving. It had been carved into the plaster with the point of a small pocket knife, 4 inches above the baseboard, in a place no one would ever have seen unless they had crouched down behind the machine to look. A heart. Inside the heart, E plus D. Beneath the heart, in tiny, careful letters, April 2nd, 68. Eleanor lowered herself carefully to the floor of the projection booth. She sat on the dusty boards with her knees pulled up, the way an old woman sits when she does not want to ever get up again, and she pressed 2 fingers to the carving, and she closed her eyes. On the 3rd day, she did not go to the theater. She sat in her room at the Glenroy Inn and let Margaret bring her tea and chicken and dumplings, and Margaret, who was a wise woman, did not ask Eleanor a single question. On the 4th day, Eleanor returned. She climbed the carpeted ramp to the balcony and swept the 4 short rows of seats there. Under seat C3, she found a small paper bag, folded twice, containing the brittle wrapper of a Snickers bar. The bag was dated, in pencil, on the outside, Dr. March 14th, 69, last shift. Danny had eaten this candy bar on the last day he worked at the theater before he shipped out for basic training. He had folded the bag and put it carefully under the seat. She did not know why. Perhaps he had meant to throw it away on his way out and had forgotten. Perhaps he had meant for someone, someday, to find it. Eleanor put the bag in her handbag and zipped the handbag closed. On the 5th day, she stood behind the concession counter and went through the drawers. In the bottom drawer, beneath an old order book and a coil of red ribbon, she found a battered cardboard timesheet. 43 names had been written on it in faded pencil. Most of them she did not know. But near the top, on the line marked Projectionist's Assistant, in the careful, slanted hand of a boy of 19, was the name Danny Reeves. His shift hours were noted beside it: Monday, Wednesday, Friday evenings, Saturday all day. He had earned $1.40 an hour. Eleanor traced the letters of his name with the tip of her finger, and she let her finger rest on the R for a long time. On the 6th day, she did not clean. She sat in row K, seat 12, and looked at the heavy red velvet curtain that hung in front of the screen. She thought of the things Danny had told her about that curtain, how heavy it was, how the rope and pulley system worked, how it took 2 strong men to raise it for the matinee on a Saturday, and how he and his Uncle Mike had always raised it together. The curtain hung now as it had hung the night the theater closed in '87, frozen in its raised position, its bottom hem trailing dust. She sat in row K, seat 12, and she stared at that curtain for a long time. And then very slowly, the way a thought sometimes comes when it has been waiting a long time to come, she had a thought she could not quite name. It was not a thought, exactly. It was more like the way a small bell sounds in a far room. She did not know what was behind the curtain. She had never thought in 56 years to wonder. On the 7th day, she walked up onto the stage to find out. The stage was 3 steps up from the floor of the auditorium, accessed by a narrow set of wooden risers on the right side of the proscenium. Eleanor took the steps slowly, using the iron handrail. Her back protested. Her knees protested. She paid them no attention. The stage floor was warped from years of moisture and disuse. The boards groaned softly under her weight. She walked, very carefully, across the apron of the stage to the edge of the heavy red curtain. Up close, the curtain was even more decayed than it had looked from the seats. The velvet was eaten through in long lateral strips by some insect or some slow chemistry of time, and the gold-braided edging hung in loose threads where it had been moth-bitten through the years. She reached up and took a corner of the curtain in her gloved hand. She gathered her strength. She pulled. The curtain did not yield easily. Whatever rope and pulley system had once moved it had long since rusted into immobility, but the velvet itself, weakened by decades, gave a little where she had taken hold. She pulled again, harder, and a wide section of curtain peeled away from the brass ring above and swung loose, sending a soft snow of dust through the projector beam of afternoon light. Behind the curtain was the screen. The screen was not white anymore. It was the yellow-brown of an old newspaper photograph, and it was torn in 3 places, and a long stain of water damage ran down its left side. The screen had once been stretched on a wooden frame, and the wooden frame stood 18 inches forward of the back wall of the auditorium. Eleanor stepped past the loose hanging curtain and around the side of the screen into the narrow space between the screen and the wall. It was very dark in that narrow space. The afternoon light from the roof slot did not quite reach. Eleanor felt along the back wall with the flat of her gloved hand. Plaster. More plaster. A nail that had once held something. Plaster again. And then, beneath her palm, a small rectangle of something flat and cool and not plaster. She bent closer. She squinted. She drew the rectangle gently away from the wall with the tip of one finger. It had been held there by 4 pieces of yellowed Scotch tape, 3 of which had already lost their grip. Now the 4th surrendered. The rectangle came free into her hand. She carried it carefully back into the light. It was a small, flat tin box, the kind that had once held candy. The lid was hand-painted in fading colors. A Turkish fez man holding a tray of taffy. Bonomo Turkish taffy, the lid said. The tin had once been Danny's lunchbox, briefly, in his early shifts before his mother had bought him a proper metal lunch pail. Eleanor knew this because Danny had told her so in one of those long, winding stories that boys of 19 tell girls of 18 in the slow blue evenings of an unending spring. Across the painted face of the tin lid, in black grease pencil, in a hand she had not seen in 56 years, 3 words had been written. For Eleanor. If you find this, I love you. She did not open it. Not yet. She walked, holding the tin in both gloved hands, the way a woman holds a sleeping bird, off the stage and down the steps and across the auditorium and up the aisle to row K, where she lowered herself into seat 12 and placed the tin on her lap. Eleanor sat for several minutes in the dark theater with the tin on her lap. She removed her gloves. She set them beside her on the empty seat. She drew her bare fingers across the lid of the tin and read the 3 words again, slowly, and then once more. Her hands were steady. She had expected them to be shaking. They were not. She put one thumb against the lip of the lid. She pressed. The lid resisted, then gave with a thin, reluctant click. A puff of old air escaped, the captive breath of an empty afternoon in March of 1969, and the lid lifted, and Eleanor Whitcomb looked down into the tin box. Inside the tin, lying on top of everything else, was a folded sheet of lined paper. Beneath the folded paper, a small black and white snapshot, 2.5 inches square, the kind a Brownie camera made. Beneath the snapshot, a silver class ring with a small red stone, and beneath the ring, pressed flat between 2 thin pieces of waxed paper, a single mountain laurel blossom, brown now and brittle as an autumn leaf, but still recognizably a flower. Eleanor took the snapshot first. She held it close to her eyes in the dim light. It showed 2 young people standing at the bank of a river. The Holston, she remembered immediately, a swimming hole about a mile north of Glenroy that the high school kids of 1968 had called the Bend. The boy in the photograph was Danny Reeves. He was 19. He was wearing a white t-shirt and rolled-up jeans, and his hair was cut short the way the boys cut their hair that year, parted on the left, and he was laughing. The girl beside him was 18, and she was wearing a pale yellow sundress with a thin yellow ribbon at the waist, and her hair was dark and long, and the boy was holding it lightly back from her face with one hand because the wind was coming off the river. The girl was Eleanor. She remembered the dress and the ribbon and the afternoon and the sound of the cicadas in the trees behind them. She had given this photograph to Danny in the August of 1968. She had not known he had kept it. She put the photograph on the seat beside her. She took out the class ring next. Glenroy High School, class of 1968, the inscription said, ringing the small red garnet stone. The silver had tarnished, but the engraving was still legible. Inside the band, in tiny scratched letters, 2 initials had been added by hand after the ring was made, DR plus E. She put the ring on the tip of her smallest finger because it would not fit anywhere else, and it hung loose there, and she let it stay. She took out the pressed mountain laurel. She did not remember which mountain laurel it had been. There had been so many. They had grown along the path to the swimming hole and along the road to her father's farm, and Danny had picked them for her any time he happened to be walking past one in bloom. She set the flower carefully on the seat beside the photograph, and a small piece of it broke away and drifted to the floor. And she did not retrieve it because some things, once they have begun to fall, should be allowed to finish falling. And then she unfolded the letter. The paper had been folded for 56 years. It opened reluctantly with thin paper cracks along the creases. The handwriting inside was Danny's, the same careful slanted hand from the timesheet in the concession counter drawer, the same boyish hand that had once written her name on the inside of his civics textbook. The ink was a faded blue. There were 2 pages. Eleanor put on her reading glasses. She held the pages in both hands. She began to read aloud, very quietly to the empty theater. "My dearest Ellie," the letter began. "I'm writing this on the last Saturday morning before I leave for basic, and Uncle Mike has gone to fetch his coffee, and I'm alone in the booth with the projector cold for once. And I'm thinking about you. I've decided to tape this letter behind the screen because the curtain comes down for the final show on Saturday night. Sound of Music, the closing night picture, and I know you said you would come with Margaret because Margaret loves it more than anything, and I have asked Uncle Mike to keep the curtain raised at the very end while everyone files out. And I will be watching from the booth, and when the curtain goes back up after the picture I will see you, my Ellie, see you for the last time before I ship out, and you will not know that I am watching. And that is exactly how I want it." The letter went on for 2 pages. Eleanor read it slowly, the way she had once read prayers in the little Methodist church where her father had taken her every Sunday morning of her childhood. Danny wrote that he wanted her to know that even if he did not come back, and he said the word back rather than home, which struck her now with a small fresh sharpness, he wanted her to live. He told her to live a long, good life. He told her to marry a kind man and have children, and grow vegetables in a garden and laugh when she could and weep when she had to and not be afraid of either. He apologized that they had not had time to ask her father properly. He said that he hoped, in another life, they might have lived in a small, white house on the road out toward the river, and raised children who would have all gotten his ears and her dark eyes. He said he hoped she would forgive him for the thing he was about to go and do, which he did not entirely understand, and which he was not sure was a right thing or a wrong thing, but only a thing his country had asked of him, and which he had decided he could not refuse. At the bottom of the second page, in slightly different ink, as though it had been added later, perhaps the night before he shipped out, perhaps even at the bus station in the cold blue hour before his bus had pulled away, Danny had written 4 lines in a darker and steadier hand. "Ellie, if you are reading this and I am gone, then the world has done a thing I did not want it to do. But you must not let it do another. Live. Love again, be kind to your husband, whoever he is, be a mother to your children, plant the garden, and once a year, on the 2nd of April, sit somewhere quiet and think of me and I will be there. Yours always, until the projector flickers out, Danny." The letter ended. Eleanor sat in row K, seat 12, with the letter in her lap and her glasses misted and her cheeks wet. And she wept the way a woman weeps when she has been given, at the age of 74, the permission she should have been given at the age of 19 and was not. She wept aloud now, and her voice rose into the rafters of the old theater, and was absorbed by the dust and the gilt and the cobwebbed chandelier. And she wept until the afternoon light, through the slot in the roof, had moved across the stage and out of the auditorium entirely, and the theater was dark, and she was sitting in the dark with her dead boy's letter in her hands. When she had finished, she folded the letter carefully along its old creases. She put it back in the tin. She put the photograph back in the tin. She put the ring back in the tin. She put the broken mountain laurel back in the tin, gently as though it might still feel pain. She closed the lid. She walked out of the theater. She locked the door behind her with the brass key. And she walked, very slowly, in the cold, blue evening of Glenroy, Tennessee, back to the Glenroy Inn, where Margaret Halloran was waiting in the kitchen by the wood stove, with 2 cups of tea poured and waiting on the table. Margaret took one look at Eleanor's face when she came through the back door and asked no questions at all. She set Eleanor at the kitchen table by the wood stove. She poured her a bowl of chicken and rice soup. She cut a slice of buttermilk pound cake. She poured a cup of strong tea with sugar and a splash of cream. She put a small folded handkerchief on the table beside the saucer. Then she sat down across from Eleanor with her own cup of tea, and she said very softly, "Mrs. Whitcomb, whatever it is, I'm here and I'm quiet." Eleanor ate the soup. She ate the cake. She drank the tea. After a long while, she said, "My name was Ellie Reeves once, or it should have been, a long time ago." Margaret nodded slowly. "My daddy was Robert Halloran," she said. "He used to work the boilers at the Bijou. He always said the projectionist's boy, Danny, had a girl named Ellie who looked like a candle in a window." Eleanor closed her eyes. She did not open them for some time. When she opened them again, she said, "Margaret, I think I am going to fix it." "Fix it?" Margaret asked, though her face had already understood. "The theater," Eleanor said. "I am going to fix the Bijou." That night, in her room at the inn, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk by the window and made a list. She made the list in pencil, in the same careful schoolgirl hand she had used as a girl, on a sheet of paper from Margaret's notepad with a small watercolor goldfinch in the corner. The list was 3 pages long when she had finished. It included the roof, which would need to be patched in 7 places and replaced entirely over the projection booth. It included the seats, which would need to be reupholstered or replaced where the springs had gone. It included the projector, which would need to be examined by a specialist who knew the old carbon arc machines. It included the screen, which would need to be replaced from the bare frame outward. It included the front marquee, which would need new letters cut by a man in Knoxville who still made such things. It included a great many smaller items, new wiring, new plumbing in the small lobby restroom, paint for the murals, polish for the brass. She would use Walter's life insurance money, which she had never touched, and which she had been keeping, she could never have said for what. She would use her late Aunt Hattie's small inheritance. She would use what was left of her own savings if she had to. She would not borrow, and she would not ask the bank, and she would not ask her children because her children had their own lives and this was not for them. At least not yet, and there would be a time for that later. She did not intend to run the theater as a business. She intended to open it once a week on Friday evenings and show a single classic picture, and charge nothing for admission and pop fresh popcorn behind the old concession counter, and let the old people of Glenroy come and sit in the dark and remember what it had been to be young at the Bijou. In the morning, she walked into town, and she found an electrician named Curtis Reeves, and yes, he was Danny's nephew, his older brother's boy, born after Danny had gone, who had grown up hearing of an uncle he had never met. Curtis was 61 now, and he had 3 grown daughters, and when Eleanor told him who she was, he sat down on the sidewalk bench in front of his shop, and he did not speak for a full minute. Then he said, "Aunt Ellie, I have been waiting my whole life to meet you." Curtis brought a roofer. Curtis brought his cousin who knew about projectors. Curtis brought his middle daughter, who ran a small upholstery business out of a barn behind her house. Word moved across Glenroy the way water moves in a dry creek bed when the rain finally comes. Slowly, then everywhere at once. By the end of the second week, Eleanor was no longer alone. There were 8 people working on the theater, and there were 12 more bringing food at lunchtime, and there were old men coming in just to sit in the back row with their hats in their hands and watch the work being done and to remember the names of the boys they had grown up with and the names of the girls those boys had loved. 6 months later, on the 2nd of August, the marquee of the Glenroy Bijou Theater was lit for the first time in 36 years. The new letters had been hand-cut by a man in Knoxville who specialized in such things. They spelled, in 3-foot red enamel, against the warm August dusk, the Glenroy Bijou. Reopening. Friday, 7 p.m. The sound of music. Free admission. Popcorn included by 6 o'clock in the evening, a line had formed on the sidewalk. By 6:30, the line stretched the length of the block. The people of Glenroy, Old people mostly, but also their children and grandchildren and the curious teenagers who had heard their grandmothers talk about it at supper wore their Friday night clothes. The women wore dresses they had not put on in years. The men had combed their hair. Several of them carried small bouquets of wildflowers because they did not know quite what else to bring to such an occasion as this. And bringing flowers had seemed, somehow, like the right thing. Inside the lobby, Eleanor stood behind the concession counter in a pale yellow sundress with a thin yellow ribbon at the waist. A dress she had bought new for the occasion, the closest match she could find to the dress she had worn in November of 1967 to a Saturday night showing of Bonnie and Clyde. And she handed out paper bags of popcorn, freshly popped in the old machine that Curtis's daughter had restored over the spring. She did not charge anyone. She did not even take a thank you except in the form of a nod. Sarah had flown in from Portland. Michael had driven down from Boston. Caroline had come from Phoenix. They sat together in the front row, the three of them in the seats marked F7, F8, and F9. And they wore the slightly stunned look of grown children who have just realized that their mother had a life before she was their mother, and that this life had been waiting all along in a town they had never heard her name. Eleanor had explained none of it to them. She had only asked them, 3 months earlier on the phone, to come to a thing she was doing on the 2nd of August. And they had come. At 7 o'clock, Eleanor walked down the center aisle of the auditorium. She did not sit in the front row with her children. She climbed the slight incline to row K. She turned right. She counted 12 seats in. She put her hand on the back of seat 12. She lowered herself into it. On the armrest of seat 13, beside her, empty, she had placed 3 small things: the black and white snapshot from the river, the silver class ring with the small red stone, the pressed mountain laurel in a fresh sheet of waxed paper. She left her hand on the armrest of seat 13 where his hand had once rested. She did not need to look at it. She knew it was there. The house lights dimmed. There was the long-forgotten metallic clatter of an old projector beginning its work, and then there was the long, bright beam, thick with dust motes, throwing its rectangle of light up onto the new screen. And then there was the sound of an orchestra rising, and the green of the Austrian mountains, and a woman in a blue dress running across a meadow singing. The sound of music ran for 2 hours and 47 minutes. When it was over, the lights came up. Nobody applauded. Nobody knew what to do, because nobody had been to a real picture show in this theater in 36 years, and the manners of such things had been forgotten along with the rest. They sat where they sat, and they cried where they cried, and they wiped their eyes with handkerchiefs and with the cuffs of their sleeves, and after a long while they stood up in 2s and 3s, and they began, quietly, to file out into the warm August night of Glenroy, Tennessee, with the small folded paper bags of popcorn still in their hands. Eleanor stayed. When the last person had gone, when only the soft hum of the projector remained, and the gentle ticking of a film reel slowly winding back to its beginning, Eleanor Whitcomb sat in row K, seat 12, with her hand on the armrest of seat 13. She was 74 years old. She was a widow. She had been forgotten by the world for a long, quiet time. But on this Friday evening in August, in a small theater in a small town in the foothills of Tennessee, with a yellow sundress on her lap and her dead boy's class ring on her smallest finger and a faded snapshot leaning against the armrest beside her, Eleanor Whitcomb was not forgotten anymore. She had been forgotten at 74. She had bought a $10 small theater, and what she had found behind its curtain had not been in the end only her first love. It had been the part of herself she had once believed died in the summer of 1969, and the proof, written in a boy's careful hand on lined paper, that some kinds of love do not need the projector to keep flickering. They keep all on their own in the dark.